Hello, this is your host Todd Lewis of the Praise of Pi podcast. I am again joined by my resident Baudrillard expert, Michael Paul, working on his Deaf Athletics PhD. How are you doing, Michael Paul?
I'm doing really good. Thank you for having me on again, and I'm always buzzing whenever we get to talk about Baudrillard. So I'm very happy. Thank you for having me on.
Right. So yeah, you wanted me to read The Spirit of Terrorism and a Requiem for the Twin Towers. I read all four essays, so a little bit of overkill here. But what are the big ideas of the Spirit of Terrorism you want to hit on tonight?
Yeah, this is kind of like an interesting cultural dynamic that is endemic to the French, because they've had to live with terrorism in terms of like an antagonism to the West for longer than the rest of the West. I would say, with Algerian terrorism, as well as everything that's happened leading up to the migrant crisis, post-migrant crisis. It's been something that's weighed heavily on the front of the French mind for a long time. And so Baudrillard actually, he makes mention of hostage takers and terrorists, and he'll write little notes, that are referential to this. And so I think this would be good to get to the heart of what he thinks about, what these actions mean, in the broader sense. And generally, he breaks down terrorism to a symbolic exchange with power, and that's something new, whereas like just a simple martyrdom or an act of mass violence, like you could think of, I don't know, starvation riots, in antiquity, they could have led to, I don't know, events in the marching of history, but they don't have the same, character as what we have now. This is a new phenomenon in modernity, and this is kind of his thesis, as well as his thesis on terrorism, as well as kind of a bidding adieu to the Twin Towers.
Yeah. Now, one of the big ideas that I saw on in the first essay, "The Spirit of Terrorism," which I believe is on page 10, is his description of terror as a shadow. He says, "Terrorism, like viruses, is everywhere. There is a global profusion of terrorism which accompanies any system of domination as though it were its shadow, ready to activate itself anywhere like a double agent." I thought that was a very informative perspective. So, for example, in antiquity, we had the Jewish terrorists, the Sicarii, the Zealots who were fighting the Romans. We could view the nihilists and anarchists fighting the Tsarist regime in 19th century Russia. There always does seem to be this dissatisfied minority that resists.
Yeah, it's for this section. Even if you continue on, I think this is telling. We can no longer draw a demarcation line around it. It is at the very heart of this culture which combats it, right? And then if you continue on, um, so if you continue on page 11, starting at there is indeed a fundamental antagonism here, but one which points past the specter of America, which is perhaps the epicenter, but in no sense the sole embodiment of globalization, and the specter of Islam, which is not the embodiment of terrorism either, to triumphant globalization battling against itself. And this is his kind of pivot, where he's saying, coming from that point where you can see this as like merely an historical event, all the way into, um, oh my gosh, there's actually like an ideological possession for something that is not Islam and not the idea of America. It is actually globalization, fighting something else, and it turns out it's fighting himself. And he goes on to say that this is kind of a suicidal act, power, or the hegemon being America, especially at the height of hegemony, in the 2000s. Actually, this push away from like the idea of war and violence, and it's something that's been massaged out of the social consciousness, is something that actually has come around to bite us in the ass, because we actually shot ourselves in the foot. That's where he's kind of making the pivot to, this is kind of our own fault, kind of.
Yeah, yeah. And as far as terrorism itself and whether Islam. Now he wants to say that terrorism, this shadow, anything could fill the shadow, and I think he even mentions like Cold War acts of terror, which predate the rise of the then modern Islamist movements, which would have been politically motivated. And I think he says elsewhere that we're sort of beyond political motivation. That was a 20th century mentality. And I think it was in his Requiem to the Twin Towers, he even looks into the sort of conspiracy theories that it was the hegemony doing it to itself. And what he says is that whether it was Islamic terrorism or the hegemony doing it to itself, which is interesting because if you go back to Simulacra and Simulation in the first chapter, he says, if there's an act of terror, how can you tell who did it? Is it the far right, the far left, or the government staging it? In the age of Simulacra, you can't. So he's basically saying it doesn't matter who did it, whether it was the deep state, as we call it today, or Islamic terrorism. The very nature of hegemony itself demanded that this happen.
Yes, exactly. And to bolster your point where you said it's beyond, especially like terrorism in the modern sense, where it's reached kind of like a post-political a post-political like character to it, right? To these acts. He goes on to say it's even beyond good and evil on page 13 at the top, starting at when. When, for once, we have an event that defies not just morality, but any attempt, but any form of interpretation, let us try to approach it with understanding of evil. This is precisely where the crucial point lies in the total misunderstanding on the part of Western philosophy, on the part of enlightenment, of the relation between good and evil. We believe naively that progress of good, its advance in all fields, the sciences, technology, democracy, human rights, corresponds to a defeat of evil. No one seems to have understood that good and evil advance together as part of the same movement. The triumph of the one does not eclipse the other. Far from it. In metaphysical terms, evil is regarded as an accidental mishap. But this axiom, from which all the Manichaean forms of the struggle of good against evil derive, is illusory. Good does not conquer evil, nor indeed does the reverse happen. They are at once both irreducible to each other and inextricably interrelated. So, like, this is bolstering both points where you said this is a shadow. This is something that is these concepts are metaphysically linked, right? Talking about like the good and evil, right? And how are trying to divorce these ideas, in the popular conscience actually made the exponential growth of evil into something like a post good and evil act, like an act of ultimate, like you can't think of it. It's so unthinkable that this is where it comes from, is this division in people's mind between good and evil, and whether or not, like especially in the West, good can triumph evil. And he said before, it's not, it's a shadow. It will always be with us.
Right. Now, I'm gonna mix a little bit of what I read extra into this, but this idea that terrorism is the shadow of the hegemony, and that the Americans who view them, the globalist hegemony, which views itself as the pinnacle of goodness, cannot conceive of any motivation for terror because they must be insane. We're good. He later says that the Americans viewed God as punishing them for being too good. It's almost like, since the hegemony cannot conceive of any opposition to it except itself, it then turns in against itself to punish itself for lack of any opposition.
Right, and this is where Baudrillard, even in this chapter, he talks about the dualness of the towers, and how that is ultimately symbolic of the, like, through monopoly we have triumph over the other evil, which was the Soviet era. And so, who do we have to fight against in a representative form, in a symbolic form, like in architecture, like the New York skyline? It would be us versus ourselves, right? It would be the twinness of the towers and the symbolic the symbology of both towers falling together. Like if one had fell, then it wouldn't have been like the mass psychosis event that it actually was. Right? He said it was necessary for both of them to fall, for like this really weird black box that we can't see into, for us to pass through that door and actually come into like a new understanding of good and evil, where evil had returned.
Yeah, the other aspect that I like, or I think is interesting about how he defines terrorism, the reason why terrorism is such a potent threat to the hegemony is that it's risking everything. Like it risks life ending in death. So there's no stakes anymore, right? I can't up your death. It's that was the highest stake and you already played it. So it's sort of like on the playground when, like, you what was it? I triple dog area. You can't go beyond that. So if you go nuclear first, that's seen as bad taste. You got to go. I dog area, I double dog area, then I triple dog area. When you do terrorism, and you kill yourself, you went straight to the top, and there's no room left for escalation, no room left to save face, which humiliates the system.
Right. And to bolster your point about the American conscience feeling as though this is unfair, right? You play chips that weren't originally on the table. I couldn't see that you had these chips by going all in. You put more than all in, if that makes sense. He goes on to say on page 16, starting at they have in about the middle. They have succeeded in turning their own deaths into absolute weapons against a system that operates on the basis of the exclusion of death. And this is something that we talked about last time, and Baudrillard talks a lot about in Symbolic Exchange in Death. I think probably one of his most important works, and it's a slog to get through. So I don't recommend it a lot. But he talks about the Western spirit, or the Western like political formula, is completely based upon kind of massaging the comfort center of people's brains so they don't think about death, and so in the complete exclusion of something where, like, oh, you can think just 100 years ago people would bury their own dead and stuff like that, and instead we have this mechanized, medicalized massaging of our egos in order to exclude it. But I'll continue. A system whose ideal is an ideal of zero deaths. Every zero death system is a zero sum game. The game theory comes in. And all the means of deterrence and destruction can do nothing against an enemy who has already turned his death into a counterstrike weapon. What does the American bombing matter? Our men are as eager to die as the Americans are to live. Hence the non-equivalence of the 4,000 deaths inflicted at the stroke of on a zero death system. So in this, it speaks, I think, perfectly to the American consciousness, saying, well, that is completely immoral and unfair.
Yeah, first thing I think of is right before the U.S. pulled out of Afghanistan, Vice interviewed Taliban fighters, and they said that as long as we fight and die, we win. So it's like you can't beat that. That's literally what I thought when I heard the interview, and that's what Baudrillard was saying 20 years earlier.
Right, and on the end of page 17, which this is like a triple underline moment, starting at the terrorist hypothesis. This is even something that Cody Wilson, someone I'm a very big fan of his philosophy and his thinking on this, has made mention to. The terrorist hypothesis is that the system itself will commit suicide in response to the multiple challenges posed by deaths and suicides. Right, and it comes in a different form, like death in the form of a symbolic exchange, in terms of how Baudrillard articulates it, because the system can exclude regular deaths. Just look at Canada, right? Yeah, as long as it's medicalized and there's a system and there's forms you have to fill out, and eventually you get your certificate of death, and then you can keel over in the nitrogen tank or something like that. That's fine. We can exclude that kind of death, right, in the public psyche, right? But we cannot exclude like a terrorist hypothetical death. That is something that kind of breaks our brain, and it's harder for the system to exclude, and that's why every time it rocks the foundations of the whole world.
Well, this is not an exact analogy because the Roman system was not a zero death system. But Christian martyrdom serves an identical role to the terrorist system here because the Christian in the Roman context was willing to risk it all and die, whereas the Romans were not. They wanted to live. And so one could argue that Christianity ended up humiliating the Roman Empire by raising the stakes to the point where the Roman Empire couldn't match it.
Yeah. Yeah, you see, and I'm trying to find the section. There's somewhere else where he made mention. It was very poetic. Well, we'll find it eventually. I have it underlined somewhere where he talks about the double dealing or the upping the stakes, where it feels like there's an extra chip being played. But instead, let me direct your attention to page 19, starting at we have to face the facts. We have to face the facts and accept that a new terrorism has come into being. And he's talking about in comparison to like old acts of mass violence or something like that, or hunger strike or hunger violence or these things, right? He's talking in comparison to them. Uh, a new terrorism has come into being, a new form of action which plays the game and lays hold of the rules of the game solely with the aim of disrupting it. Not only do these people not play fair, since they put their own deaths into play. Oh, there it is. To which there is no possible response. They are cowards. But they have taken over all the weapons of the dominant power: money, stock market, speculation, computer technology, aeronautics, spectacle, and the media networks. They have assimilated everything of modernity and globalism without changing their goal, which is to destroy that power. They have even, and this is the height of cunning, used the banality of American everyday life as cover and camouflage, sleeping in their suburbs, reading and studying with their families before activating themselves suddenly like a time bomb. The faultless mastery of this clandestine style of operation is almost as terroristic as the spectacular act of September 11, I'll add, itself. Since it casts suspicion on any and every individual, might not any inoffensive person be a potential terrorist? If they could pass unnoticed, then each of us is a criminal going unnoticed. Every plane also becomes suspect. And in the end, this is no doubt true. And so this is a big moment, that last point where he talks about all of a sudden we all feel like everyone else, like we're just sitting in a Mexican standoff, just pointing fingers at each other, where anyone and everyone could be a threat. All of a sudden, uh, kind of like psychology at large has changed into this mode of self-preservation. Everything is a danger, right? It's we need to inject certain experimental things into our bodies in order to be healthier. We need to mitigate these risks. Everything is some sort of public safety risk and has to be mitigated by some managerial measure of some sort. Everything started to boil down into a therapeutic state solution for everything because that fear became permanent.
Yeah. That also ties into the point that he makes that the sort of rolling back of civil liberties and freedoms with the national security state, which we've seen 22 years out, he was absolutely right about. That's happened. As a result of that, right? Because if anybody could theoretically be a terrorist, you're going to have all these security measures to make sure that this doesn't happen again. And the other thing that he points out, which in light of COVID is extremely prescient, is that this was the end of the global order. This was the end of the globalism, right? Nobody was saying this was the end of globalism in 2001. You might hear people say that now, that globalism is ending, especially with the rise of the Chinese world reserve currency. But this is 22 years ago. He said this marks the end of globalism.
Right.
And it marks the end of globalism because it negated itself.
Right. And that's something that I think it may be, you may feel, viewers, as though that's a bit of a reach to say that, oh, well, is that really predicting the end whenever like something so catastrophic happened that it changed the dimensions of like how Western society was going to move. Of course, something was going to change. So, I'm playing devil's advocate here. That he didn't really predict anything that was like novel. I think anyone who had their head screwed on right would say this changed everything. However, I think his point, pointing to like hegemony starting to become, um, I don't know, like self-effacing, a ridiculous, like especially with some of these biosecurity measures and stuff like that. It's ridiculous to take off your shoes at the airport, right? It's ridiculous to, this, that, or the other security measure or law that's unenforceable, or this, that, the other. Like all of these things on their face logically are ridiculous, right? So him seeing where that would trend, where power, uh, power and the hegemonic West actually turns in on itself. I think that was something that he predicted, that even though anyone else could have said, "Oh, this changes everything. We're going to go to war," or any of the regular punditry that was on the news leading up to all the other wars that we had in the Middle East, right? That his point about this becoming an internal facing, we have to war with ourselves, that I think is a novel point, and he got it right.
Yeah. Now, before we move on, what do you think of my idea that the Christian martyr is playing the same game, and that's what the Christians did to the Roman Empire?
Yeah, so I think we've talked in private. I don't know if we mentioned so much last time I was on, but this is the key component of like a concept that comes from Cody Wilson and Baudrillard that I'm a big fan of, called death athletics, right? And it's derivative of Baudrillard and also a little bit of Nietzsche with the tightrope walker as he dies. So these are kind of like two mirroring concepts. Uh, at least one from Baudrillard with the symbolic death exchange, and then the second being like the story Nietzsche was telling with the tightrope walker, with death meaning something, right? So if you proffer even your symbolic death, as Cody Wilson said, and you make that symbolic death, like you're not actually dying, but it looks like in the media you're gonna go to jail forever or something because you've transgressed some taboo, then that symbolic death means something. It can have the same death or same meaning as the Christian martyrs. And in this speech I'm talking about, where Cody Wilson explains this concept, it's the same thing as the Christian martyrs, where they say, Chad, yes, of course, you should crucify me just as Jesus, because I believe in him that much. Yes, I actually do take my life because it means something, right? And I think we're going to circle back to this, to the death athletic concept in the last little phrase at the end, but we'll circle back to that. But yeah, I do agree with your idea. Like, this is what the Christian martyrs did.
Well, and even without going to full martyrdom, in 1 Peter 4:4 we read, in regard to these, they think it strange that you do not run with them in the same flood of dissipation, speaking evil of you. That's a simulated death exchange, because
Yes.
by refusing to engage with the dissipated culture of the world, you've died in a sort of social context. So people don't like that, because what you've done is you've done a simulated death exchange.
Yes. Yes. And I think you've hit the nail on the head. And I think we're good to move on if you're ready. I've got a passage lined up
Yeah,
on
go ahead. What
page.
number?
I think, yeah, I'm gonna skip that one. Page 23, starting at suicidal terrorism.
Okay.
Actually, we'll do this one and we'll go back to 22 in a second. But this is where Baudrillard is redetailing what he thinks about yeah, the petty violence, the petty terrorism from before like the full advent of modernity. Suicidal terrorism was a terrorism of the poor. This is a terrorism of the rich. This is what particularly frightens us talking about modern terrorism. The fact that they have become rich, they have all the necessary resources without ceasing to wish to destroy us. Admittedly, in terms of our system of values, they are cheating, and it is not playing fair to throw one's own death into the game. But this does not trouble them, and the new rules are not ours to determine. But there's a key line here. Um, he said they have all the resources in order to perpetuate, like acts of terrorism, like taking over an airplane. They understand how to fly an airplane, right? That is something that is technologically rich, right? It takes a certain amount of time and technological understanding and kind of like fortitude to get through all of the excesses of modernity and still not get swayed away from your initial goal of like doing the thing. um that's an interesting point, because that's a point basically taken from Jihad versus McWorld, another book that I think Mr. Prudentialist has done a good reading of, or a good review of. That I think, like, this is Jihad versus McWorld in one sentence from before Jihad versus McWorld, because he's talking about, whoa, 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 they made it through all the riches of modernity and didn't get swayed and didn't fall into like a hypnotic trance. That's weird, and that's why it terrifies us. They should be hypnotized.
Yes, there was, to use a movie reference, there was I think it was 1954 film called, was it A Terror in a Texas Town, where this gunslinger goes around shooting people, and he's going to square off against, I think, like an ex-whaler with a harpoon or something. But in the lead up to the final showdown, he fights a do-gooder who's no match for him and shoots him down. But he has doubts about his final confrontation with the hero, because this do-gooder that he killed was not afraid to die. And he's like, I just went up against a man who wasn't afraid of me, even though I did eventually kill him. And that's what breaks his nerve, so that at the end of the movie, he's killed by the hero.
Yeah, you see, like this whole sense, Baudrillard actually makes a lot of allusions to gambling as well, like this, who's gonna break their nerves first. Like whenever you have this kind of like societal exchange, if you will, between like an aggressor and the innocent bystander, right? In terms of like how we're viewing this situation symbolically, right? uh, there is a question about whether or not this is like a game of chance, right? We're actually playing Russian roulette here, and the terrorists are the ones like putting the gun on the table, or actually passing it back and forth and pulling the trigger for you, right? And I think that's very interesting. You bring it back to nerves, right? Breaking the nerves of someone, because that's a gambling that's a gambling concept, right? There's not very many other times other than regular war that becomes a something you need to think about in everyday life. Like, I don't work, like when I go to work, I don't have to break someone's nerves to get what I want, like, ever. I can't think of the last time I actually had to mean mug someone to get something. Whereas like maybe war and games of chance, you do.
So, just as a quick clarification, the within the struggle of hegemony versus terrorism, what's unfair is the terrorist stakes his life. Now, in a war, both sides stake their life. So, how are these two conflicts different? Like, how would they be contextualized within Baudrillard?
Oh, so war, it depends in the specifics. Like modern war is a little bit different. I was talking about more in the historical sense, and divorcing it from like Baudrillard's like main thesis about symbolic exchange, because like the the symbolic richness of like a, I don't know, like a Roman war campaign or something like that, in the various battles along the campaign, that has something to do with more with like a societal story. That's something that's pre-modernity, which is something that Baudrillard's kind of a diagnostician of. It's kind of
Okay.
separate. He does in earlier works talk about like the symbolic richness of at more ancient societies and stuff like that, and he describes that as an ideal that was like a genuine there was a genuine symbolism behind like having a good enemy to fight, or having a good friend, and all basically everyone contextualized the symbolic value of the different aspects of their life more genuinely.
All right. Now you said you wanted to check something on 21,
Or 22.
22.
Starting so the secret of such success lies elsewhere. Um but actually below that, the difference is that we are dealing not with an employment contract. He's talking about, like the success of terrorists, like how they won, right? He's talking about their win state right here. But with a and also like why they are not kind of hypnotized by modernity at the same time. The difference is that we are dealing not with an employment contract, but with a pact and a sacrificial obligation. Such an obligation is immune to any defection or corruption. The miracle is to have adapted to the global network and technical protocols without losing anything of this complicity unto death. Unlike the contract, the pact does not bind individuals. Even their suicide is not individual heroism. It is a collective sacrificial act sealed by an ideal demand. And it is the combination of two mechanisms, the operational structure and the symbolic pact, that made an act of such excessiveness possible. And I think that's interesting where he's talking about like the mentality of someone who's going to do something horrible like this, like that. It's not so much that oh, this is just something I have to do, right? They wouldn't think about it in mechanical terms, like, oh, I'm going to go do this in order to like save my homeland or something like that. It's deeper than that. This is a pact somewhere deep in my heart and soul. This is something that I'm so compelled to do. It's like fated in the stars, and I've made this pact, with my people as a whole, in order to do this, or to fulfill my destiny of doing this. And this is kind of like him diving into the psychology of terrorists a little bit, where they reach a breaking point and all of a sudden they make a pact. Like, I have to do this, which I think is just an interesting little side point.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So,
Mhm.
did you want to move on to the Twin Towers, or are we still on the Spirit of Terrorism?
I think the still thing on the Spirit of Terrorism, there was like two or no, there was just one more I wanted to hit. I gotta find it though.
Okay.
Uh Oh yeah, so in the end state of this is 24 and 25, another argument in bad faith. So here he's rebutting some arguments. He's rebutting the American sentiment of like, well, this wasn't fair, right? He's going back and saying, well, no, here's what you don't understand. So here's the second argument he's rebutting. Another argument in bad faith. These terrorists exchanged their deaths for a place in paradise. Their act was not a disinterested one, hence it is not authentic. It would be sorry, I'm having a day today. Their act was not a disinterested one, hence it is not authentic. It would be disinterested only if they did not believe in God, if they saw no hope in death, as is the case as is the case with us. Yet Christian martyrs assume precisely such a sublime equivalence, right? Tying back to your Christian martyr thesis. There again, then they are not fighting fair, since they get salvation, which we cannot even continue to hope for. So we mourn our deaths while they can turn theirs into high definition stakes. Fundamentally, all this causes, proof, truth, rewards, ends, and means is a typical Western form of calculation. We even evaluate death in terms of interest rates and value for money terms, an economic calculation that is a poor man's calculation. Poor men who no longer even have the courage to pay the price, right? And he's talking about like the life price, right? When it comes to like something like a war of ideas is a broad um, civilizational type wars, right? He's talking about, well, you don't even have the courage to pay the price because everything down to, guess what? You have life insurance to pay for the fees for the funeral, right? Everything is calculated. We don't think about this symbolic level stuff, and like us boiling it down to, oh well, they just wanted their 72 virgins, they made a calculation and they just pulled the trigger. No, they didn't. No, they did it for a different reason. It was not just, oh, like easy death that's done in an instant because, a plane exploding, I won't feel a thing. And then therefore I get easy 72 virgins. That was not the idea. The idea was, I'm paying my death as an ultimate price because I want to bring about the societal conflict, right? And I want to win, right? That's why I'm staking everything on it. They did not think of what they were doing in economistic terms.
Well, right. What's interesting too is the idea that life and death have calculated financial value with life insurance and life insurance policies. We've taken this to an extreme. We can think of like the ancient Germanic practice of the Wehrgild, where you pay the price of someone's death to avoid a feud. But this action is a rejection of the death price. So rather than ending the conflict, it initiates it.
Yes, that is precisely his point. Baudrillard, through several books, Symbolic Exchange of Death, Fatal Strategies, The Agony of Power. He makes mention of this as well, where having this unequal playing field, where the person or the people that are challenging hegemony have to kind of flip the table. He kind of makes mention, like he keeps that byline going through a bunch of different works as well. Let's see. I think I had one more, and that's just going to be the end on page 34 of this chapter. And I'm going to read the whole thing because I think it's particularly good. So, starting at there is no remedy. There is no remedy for this extreme situation, and war is certainly not a solution, since it merely offers a rehash of the past. With the same deluge of military forces, bogus information, senseless bombardment, emotive and deceitful language, technological deployment, and brainwashing. Like the Gulf War, a non-event, an event that does not really take place. And this indeed is the raison d'etre to substitute for a real and formidable, unique and unforeseeable event, a repetitive, rehashed pseudo event. The terrorist attack corresponds to a precedence of the event over all interpretive models, where as this mindlessly military technological war corresponds conversely to the model's precedence over the event, and hence to conflict over phony stakes to a situation of no contest. War is a continuation of the absence of politics by any other means. Right. So this last little section, he's kind of condemning the West for well, your response to this is actually to ignore everything you just learned. You just want to continue this technological solution BS for everything, and then the war machine keeps trudging on, because the modern war can be simulated, just like the Gulf War never happened. That this was another piece that Baudrillard wrote that he is making reference to. He's saying, okay, well, the way that we're going to cope with this is slamming everything back into the non-event. We're going to go back in the time of no events. There's no contest. There's no anything. We're going to have a simulated war in order to massage our egos again. And in the end, we didn't really learn anything. And it's kind of like a finger wag, like shame on you, because you should have learned something here. Like, at least it's kind of school marmy, but I think I think it rings true, at least in my ears.
Well, again, in light of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021, see, once you've done it the first time, you have to keep doing it, because the simulated non-event of the war on terror now has to be coped with the simulated non-event of a war with Russia.
Right, and it has to. We have to, every time there is something that could be like the reemergence of the event, right? Something like a 9/11. The West has to cope by at least leaning into something else that's happening that's just as catastrophic, that can be an ecstatic, TV screen, drama for everyone to watch. So everyone gets hypnotized. We have to, if we don't actually cause it to happen, we have to lean into whatever's happening in the day. And this is the same for, the 24-hour news cycles. Remember murder hornets, right? That's another cope. That's another massage of our own egos in terms of, well, we're just going to lean into what is this the simulated evil we're fighting against and stuff like that. It's a non-event. We don't have murder hornets. It never happened, right? These simulated non-events are just a way for us to distract ourselves.
Yeah, from the chips being raised by the terrorists who exchanged their life and therefore, initiated the challenge and broke the rules of the game. The other thing that's funny here, right, is Baudrillard is criticizing the Americans for saying that the terrorists don't fight fair. What did the British say about the colonial patriots in the American Revolution?
They didn't fight fair.
Yeah, exactly,
they didn't fight fair.
so the key aspect of not fighting fair, there were two. There were the use of irregular forces as bushwhackers who would assassinate, basically target officers, which you just didn't do in Europe. You didn't have trained marksmen to. Well, you did after this conflict, but before it was kind of in bad taste to do that. And also George Washington, when he was being chased all over the Pennsylvania and New Jersey, he was sort of supposed to surrender at some point, but he never did. Any other European army in a similar position would have just said, yeah, we fold, we're done.
It's so funny you bring this up because Cody Wilson has alluded to the founding fathers, and the Revolutionary War being like the first instance of jihad, and that I find that very funny because like he goes back at like as a comedic point to say that over and over again. It's like actually this like the Texas Revolution or the War for Texas Independence was actually white jihad or something like that. And he says it as a throwaway comedy line, but in some way it's true. Like it's spiritually true.
No, it's true. It's true that the American patriots were not, committing acts of suicide or martyrdom, but they were at least doing a simulated death exchange by rejecting the rules that the British had supposed we would abide by in fighting this war.
Yes. That is the more salient point you should take from that instead of just jokes. Might we move on to Requiem for the Twin Towers on page 45?
Okay, 45. Here we go.
All right. Starting in the middle of the page, the violence of globalization also involves architecture. So in Requiem for the Twin Towers, I might just give the viewers some context, is actually kind of a reformulation of the chapter that or this little essay that we just read through a little bit. But it was for a live syndication for 1 year after 9/11. For some French media and culture TV event. So he actually gave a recounting of the chapter we just read live, heavily edited to, he's in New York. And yeah, some of what he said is very brash. And if you said that to an American and they could speak French and they understood, I'm sure 1 year after 9/11, there would have been fists thrown. So he did self-censor a little bit there. But to continue. The violence of globalization also involves architecture, and hence the violent protest against it also involves the destruction of that architecture. In terms of collective drama, we can say that the horror for the 4,000 victims of dying in those towers was inseparable from the horror of living in them, the horror of living and working in a sarcophagi of concrete and steel. And this is more of a, oh my gosh, he's a lib. He's a lib. He just hates the West. But I think there's something to that. And what he's talking about, he's actually making reference back to the shadow, the hegemony and its shadow being, this kind of tendrils, the force of evil that follow it. What he's saying is like, well, this original sin of the West for pushing away the shadow for too long actually like wasn't in itself its own horror. Hegemony actually made these kind of they were maybe happy in some way, but they were brutalist in others, right? Just talking about the architectural motifs of the New York skyline. It's big, it's bold, they're high towers, it's an American exceptionalism, by design, and especially the Twin Towers being this kind of like a, almost brutal character to them. Actually, it's poetic that they were the ones to fall in the terrorist attack for that very reason alone, not just that they were very important in a major hub of of industry and stuff like that. Even down to the architecture, he's saying it's poetic that this happened.
The other thing is, as far as like a take from the left that was considered inappropriate at the time, it also reminded me of Ward Churchill calling them little Eichmanns, the people that worked in the Twin Towers, because of their technocratic role within the system. Now, yeah, a lot of people, a lot of left-wing elites were, but the thing is, who would want to work in a concrete prison? I mean, to go back to Baudrillard.
Couldn't be me. Couldn't be me. Oh, I'm so glad I work outside. Oh my gosh.
I mean, that would be awful, wouldn't it?
Oh, dude.
But what's interesting too is specifically in Requiem for the Twin Towers, he says that they had to be twins of each other to represent the equivalent exchange of the financial system they represented.
Yes.
Yeah. And that in their destruction, but it's right. The problem with equivalent exchange is you can't exchange it with anything else but yourself, which is why all hegemony is self-negating. And so then the Twin Towers being the symbol of this equivalent exchange negated itself.
Right. And Baudrillard would like point at the logic of like, okay, well, power is self-negating. Okay, why doesn't it just disappear all in one day? And it's because of this like time stasis and fatal strategies Baudrillard talks about. Kind of like the stopping of time, but not in a Fukuyama-ist sense. It's in a different sense where we've actually passed a point where like the modernity thing happened and we can never locate where it started. We've actually like entered a realm of like schizopolitics and stuff like that. Everything is a little bit crazy and wacky, and because we're whacked out of our mind, we can't actually figure out what was the cause of it. But no, even to go back to your point, if we may, about the twinness, 46 starting at their destruction, middle of the page ish. Their destruction itself respected the symmetry of the towers, a double attack, separated by a few minutes interval, with a sense of suspense between the two impacts. After the first, one could still believe it was an accident. Only the second impact confirmed the terrorist attack, and in the Queen's Air crash a month later, the TV station waited, staying with the story in France for 4 hours, waiting to broadcast a possible second crash live. Since that did not occur, we shall never know whether it was an accident or a terrorist attack. The collapse of the towers is the major symbolic event. Imagine they had not collapsed, or only one had collapsed. The effect would not have been the same at all. The fragility of global power would not have been so strikingly proven. The towers, which were the emblem of that power, still embody it in their dramatic end, which resembles a suicide. Seeing them collapse themselves as if by implosion, one had the impression that they were committing suicide in response to the suicide of the suicide planes.
So real quick, I think the page numbers are off for my version, so I'm just going to remove the picture from now because for the bad. Spirit of Terrorism, it worked. The page numbers were aligned, but not.
Yeah, we're reading from this led to a bit of confusion. I might just spoil our story in the back room. Yeah, I told him just read the entirety of the Spirit of Terrorism, and he got a different edition that had 2 more essays appended, whereas I have the 2 essay version verso publication. And you were like making a big deal about it. I was like, dude, it's like 2 baby essays, and no, and now I realize that you read like double of what I told you to read. I was like, oh, that's my fault. That's my fault.
Well, here's the other thing. The other thing that I loved about the.
Oh, you muted yourself. You muted yourself. You're on mute. You're on mute.
Oh, I was on mute. No, what I was going to say, though, was what I loved about the second essay was when Baudrillard said, we need to build buildings that are worth destroying.
Man, that's where I was going to return to Death Athletics. And so I guess we can just go there now that
Go there. I love that.
Okay. So, and I posted this on Twitter earlier today because it's such a beautiful line, or a beautiful little passage. So, at the end of, or one page before the end of Requiem for the Twin Towers, he says this: one should build only those things which, by their excellence, are worthy of being destroyed. Take a look around with this radical proposition in mind, and you will see what a pass we have come to. Not much would withstand this extreme hypothesis. That's so good.
It is good. It is good.
That is juicy. And so, and he's actually, this is where he edited, closer to the end. He actually, hold on, my cat is going freaking goblin mode. Stand by.
All right, let's see what we got in the chat here while we're waiting for our esteemed Michael Pohl to return. I see we got Ev Pilliter, Minoan Record, Deepness, Vingel, Nudge Unit, John Goras, Imperator Forge, Cyber Ninja Zero, DF, and Denwo, Vulpa's Persona all in the chat. Hello.
I'm back, by the way.
You're back. Good. Okay.
So what I was going to say there is, like, that is so friggin' stop, shut up. If you're going to be in here, you got to shut up. Sorry, my cat is being a goblin.
Your cat is initiating symbolic exchange, bro.
He's about to be symbolically exchanged with Jesus if he doesn't. Okay, whatever, dude. Let's see. So I think that this end of the passage is so, that's so heckin' true in Wholesome Chungus, essentially, that because, like, how much of the system of objects that we surround ourselves with, or even the architecture, like many people online, like, it doesn't matter if you're, straight up a Wignat all the way to, like, extreme, like, traditionalist, orthodox Marxist, right? Everyone hates the architecture that we live next to. Everything is messed up. Everything is not worthy of even being destroyed. And I think him putting it that way is almost an extra salt in the wound for, like, how ugly the system of objects that surround us have become. We've reached an impasse where it's like it's only gotten worse and worse and worse. And it kind of leads into, like, this whole end is a more somber note than how he ended what I'll term the original essay, which was The Spirit of Terrorism. Right? He turns it into, even if we go all the way to the end on page 52. Moreover, although the two towers have disappeared, they have not been annihilated. Even in their pulverized state, they have left behind an intense awareness of their presence. No one who knew them can cease imagining them and the imprint they made on the skyline from all points of the city. Their end in material space has borne them off into a definitive imaginary space. By the grace of terrorism, the World Trade Center has become the world's most beautiful building, the eighth wonder of the world. And this is where he took everything where he was saying, you haven't learned anything. America, why have you done this? Don't you realize that this is a symptom of hegemony, and hegemony trying to enforce a system of zero deaths and safetyism and spiritually stultify everyone that lives under hegemony? Like, of course this was going to come back and bite you in the ass. And in the end, him going back through and adding the somber note, I think really, it means, like, he cares. Like, he heckin' Wholesome Chungus cares about you, bro.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's, I never saw the Twin Towers. Like, I was super young when all this happened, but I can only imagine, just based on the prose he put into this, and obviously care he put into that speech where he was actually going to talk in New York. And it's like, oh man, he actually really does care.
So Zoomer signaling alert.
Yeah, heckin', that's I'm the
Okay, here we go.
heckin'
Here we go.
Wilson.
This is for you. This is for you. Cracker deep music.
Dude, he is betting his life on this. And it better be worth it. You know, it's some of the other streams I've been on, like everyone's like, "Oh, cat, cool," and they're happy, but I always get real mad because he just decides, "Hey, now's the time to complain about the food bowl being half empty," right when I'm streaming.
Yeah. Well, it's about time to wrap up. So, you want to tie this all in a bow for us?
Sure. I think in closing, the Twin Towers have become in effect more beautiful, more than what they were by being gone now, and that's where he leaves the Requiem for the Twin Towers, and the reason why even the towers and the meaning behind like why life changed so drastically after 9/11. The reasoning of the terrorists, the reasoning of the Western conscience. I think that after going through all this, and this is a very short read, people, at least the edition I have, but the edition you have is still only 115, 120 pages or some on. So
Mhm.
it really is a short read, and it is very easy. It is some of the most easy reading Baudrillard work that I think you can get into, and I think it easily demonstrates like how every aspect of this event, the 9/11 event, actually played into the symbolic realm, and his theory of symbolic value. He articulates it, I think, very well in what did it mean, in the symbolic sense, and why that changed our psychology.
All right. Where can people find what you do, Mike?
Oh shoot. You can find me on Twitter at Mike of Pole. You can also find me on Substack, but I only have the one essay up there, and that's um sorry, mikeofpole.substack.com. And then you can also find me on Odyssey, where I have a video series going right now called the Homework Series that goes over the thinkers of Nick Land, Baudrillard, and Cody Wilson. I also upload some music stuff there as well.
So I'll just say this is Todd Lewis, humiliating the hegemony, one simulated death exchange at a time. Signing off.